The water of the Salish Sea is a liquid photograph of the sky. On a Tuesday morning in late October, both were the color of lead, a flat, endless expanse of gray that blurred the line between what was real and what was reflection. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of salt water and decaying leaves. A single fishing boat, a 20-foot aluminum skiff, drifted in the stillness of Haro Strait, its engine off. Its sole occupant, a man named Alex, who was more interested in the silence than the salmon. He was a sound recordist, a chaser of acoustic ghosts, and he had come here for the whales. He lowered a hydrophone, a specialized underwater microphone, over the side, the cable unspooling into the dark 50-degree water. He put on his headphones and closed his eyes, sinking into the aural landscape of the deep. He heard the crackle of snapping shrimp, the distant, low-frequency hum of a freighter miles away, and the rhythmic slosh of water against his hull. For an hour, that was all. The whales were silent. Then it came. It wasn't the usual social chatter of G-Pod, the resident orcas who called these waters home. It was a single voice, clear and achingly pure. It was a long, mournful cry that rose in pitch until it was almost a shriek, a blade of sound that cut through the background noise of the ocean. It was a call without an answer, a question hurled into the void. Alex's hands trembled as he checked the levels on his recorder. The sound was powerful, clean, and filled with a desperate, gut-wrenching emotion he had never heard from a marine mammal before. He didn't know it yet, but he was recording the loneliest animal in the world. And that single, haunting cry was about to ignite a firestorm that would circle the globe, captivate millions, and challenge our fundamental understanding of consciousness, grief, and the invisible lines that connect us all. If you've ever felt a connection to the wild, or wondered about the secret lives of the creatures we share this planet with, you need to keep watching. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're about to play you a sound that will change the way you think about the ocean forever. Aris Thorne was not a scientist. He was a musician who had found more truth in the sounds of nature than in any concert hall. He sold his recordings to documentary filmmakers and soundscape artists, making just enough to keep his boat fueled and his gear updated. When he captured the orca's cry that morning, he knew he had something special, but he didn't grasp the magnitude. The sheer acoustic complexity of the vocalization was unlike anything in his library. Usually, orca calls are rhythmic, pulsed clicks or short, distinct whistles used for coordination during a hunt or social bonding. This was sustained. It was melodic in a minor key that struck a deeply human chord of dissonance and longing. He uploaded a 30-second clip to his professional server that night, labeling it G-Pod Solitary Vocalization, Haro Strait, and sent a link to a few of his clients. He thought it might end up as background noise in a nature film about the Pacific Northwest. He was wrong. Within 24 hours, the file had been leaked. A young intern at a production company in Los Angeles, moved to tears by the raw emotion of the sound, had posted it on a Reddit forum dedicated to ocean mysteries. The post was titled simply, "Have you ever heard a whale sound this sad?" The internet answered with a resounding roar. The clip went viral in a way that few things ever do. It didn't just get views. It got under people's skin. It spread from the niche corners of Reddit to the trending topics of Twitter, then migrated to the emotional feeds of Facebook and the remix culture of TikTok. News anchors played it over images of breaching whales. Electronic music producers sampled it in melancholic tracks that topped the charts in Europe. People played it on their phones in coffee shops and on subways, the high, mournful cry of a creature from the deep echoing through the concrete canyons of human cities. It was dubbed the Cry. Scientists were baffled. Dr. Aris Thorne, no relation to Alex, was the lead cetacean biologist at the Friday Harbor Labs. He was a man who dealt in data, not emotion. He spent his days analyzing population statistics, salmon counts, and pollution levels. But when his lab was inundated with calls from journalists and concerned citizens, he had no choice but to listen. He sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of research papers, and pulled up the spectrogram of the recording, the visual representation of the sound. He saw what Alex had heard. It was a single, pure tone, rising from 2 kilohertz to over 15 kilohertz, holding the peak for 3 seconds before fading into a ragged, breathy finish. "It's a distress call," Aris said to his team, a group of bleary-eyed grad students who had been fielding the calls for 48 hours straight. A contact call. It's what a calf uses to find its mother when it gets separated in strong currents. It's designed to cut through the noise of the ocean and trigger a retrieval instinct. But it's not a calf. One of the students, a young woman named Lena with a talent for acoustic analysis, pointed out. She tapped the screen where the lower harmonics were visible. The low-frequency fundamental tones, that's a mature animal. A big one. The lung capacity required to hold that note for that duration implies a full-grown adult female. "Exactly," Aris said, leaning back in his chair, the mystery deepening. "It's an adult screaming for its mother. Or screaming for something it lost. Why?" The search for the lonely whale, as the media had dubbed it, began in earnest. Whale-watching boats, research vessels, and citizen scientists armed with hydrophones fanned out across the Salish Sea, all trying to find the source of the sound that had broken the internet's heart. The water around the San Juan Islands became a grid of listening stations. Everyone wanted to be the one to find her. Everyone wanted to save her, though they didn't know what she needed saving from. They found her 2 days later near the U.S.-Canada border, in the gray, choppy waters south of Saturna Island. She was a female orca, roughly 20 years old. The researchers knew her instantly by the shape of her dorsal fin and the unique saddle patch behind it. She was J35, known to the public as Tahlequah. She was a member of the critically endangered southern resident killer whale population, a clan of just 75 individuals struggling to survive in a rapidly changing ocean. These whales were icons of the Pacific Northwest, beloved and monitored like celebrities. And she was not alone. Swimming beside her, nudged along by her rostrum, was the body of her newborn calf. It had died shortly after birth, its lungs likely not strong enough to take its first breath, or perhaps poisoned by the toxins that accumulate in the mother's milk of these apex predators. It was a small, fragile thing, its black and orange skin already starting to fade to a ghostly gray, and Tahlequah was refusing to let it go. What followed was one of the most extraordinary and heartbreaking displays of animal grief ever witnessed by modern science. For 17 days, Tahlequah carried her dead calf. She balanced it on her head. She held it in her mouth. When it slipped off and began to sink toward the dark bottom of the strait, she would dive deep to retrieve it, pushing it back to the surface with desperate, exhausting lunges. She swam for over 1,000 miles, a funeral procession of one, her journey tracked by the world's media helicopters and long-range lenses. And all the while, she cried. That single lonely call that Alex had recorded was not a one-time event. It was her constant companion. She was calling for a calf that would never answer. She was vocalizing her grief, her pain, her loss to the entire ocean. Every time the calf slipped, the cry would pierce the water, a sonic signal of her despair. The world watched, captivated and horrified. The story of Tahlequah and her dead calf became a global phenomenon. It was more than a sad animal story. It was a mirror. In a world that often felt disconnected and numb, this whale's raw, unfiltered grief felt deeply, painfully human. People saw their own losses reflected in her journey. They saw the mother who had lost a child, the person who had lost a partner, the child who had lost a parent. Tahlequah became a symbol of persistence in the face of death. But for Aris Thorne and the scientific community, she was becoming a crisis. "She's not eating," Aris said during a tense conference call with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The mood in the room was grim. She's expending thousands of calories a day, carrying the calf and swimming against the current. She's starting to show signs of malnutrition. The blubber around her dorsal fin is starting to depress, creating a condition we call peanut head. She's starving herself to death in front of the whole world. Can we intervene? An OA, a official, asked from a sterile office in Washington, D.C., looking at a PR disaster unfolding in real time. How? Aris shot back, frustration leaking into his voice. Tranquilize her? She'll drop the calf and lose her mind, and we risk hitting her with a dart and causing an infection. Try to take the calf from her? She's a 5-ton predator with a brain larger and more complex than ours. We'd have to use force. The public relations nightmare alone would destroy the agency. We can't touch her. He didn't have to finish. The world was in love with Tahlequah. Any action that looked like harassment would be met with outrage. They were paralyzed. They could only watch, document, and hope that biology would eventually override emotion. On the 10th day of her tour of grief, as the media was calling it, something changed. The hydrophones picked up a new sound. It was the cry, but it was different. It was harmonized. Another whale was singing with her. Aris pulled up the real-time acoustic data in the lab. He saw Tahlequah's call, the familiar rising shriek that had become the soundtrack of the week. But underneath it, a second voice had joined in. A lower frequency, a male. The two sounds wove together, creating a dissonant but stable chord. Who is that? Lena asked, looking over his shoulder, her coffee forgotten. Aris cross-referenced the vocal signature with their library of Southern resident calls. It's L87, he said, surprised. They call him Onyx. Onyx was a member of L-Pod, another of the 3 clans that made up the Southern resident community. But he was an anomaly. He was a lone male who often traveled separately from his family. He was a bit of a rogue, an older male who had lost his own mother years ago. And he wasn't related to Tahlequah. There was no biological reason for him to be there. The whale-watching boats, keeping a respectful distance of half a mile, saw it too. Onyx had appeared at Tahlequah's side. He wasn't trying to mate with her. He wasn't trying to steal the calf or displace her. He was just there. He swam beside her, matching her pace stroke for stroke. When she cried, he answered. When she dove to retrieve the calf, he waited at the surface, sometimes even helping to nudge the small body back up. He was bearing witness. It's social support, Aris realized, watching the drone feed. He's showing solidarity. He's telling her she's not alone. It's a pallbearer behavior. The story took another turn. The lonely whale was no longer lonely. The narrative shifted from one of solitary grief to one of communal support. The internet, which had been weeping, now felt a surge of hope. People projected their own desires for connection onto the whales. They wrote articles about the empathy of nature, but the hope was short-lived. On the 15th day, Tahlequah was visibly weakening. She was lagging miles behind the rest of J-Pod, who had been following her at a distance, as if giving her space to mourn, but refusing to abandon her completely. Onyx was still with her, but he was agitated. His calls became more urgent, shorter, more percussive. He began to nudge her, not gently, but with force, trying to get her to move faster, to rejoin the group. It was as if he was telling her, "It's time. You have to let go. You are dying." That night, under the light of a full moon that illuminated the whitecaps of the strait, the hydrophones went silent. For the first time in over 2 weeks, the cry was not heard. The research teams scrambled. The boats went out at dawn, their crews fearing the worst. Had she died? Had she finally succumbed to starvation and exhaustion and sunk to the bottom with her child? They found her just after sunrise, swimming strong and fast with the rest of G-Pod. She was hunting. She was chasing a school of Chinook salmon, her movements sharp and precise. The calf was gone. There was no body, no sign of a struggle. She had finally let it go, allowing it to sink into the abyss, returning it to the food web. The internet breathed a collective sigh of relief. The tour of grief was over. Tahlequah had survived. She had chosen life. The story, it seemed, had a happy ending. The cycle of nature had completed itself. But Aris Thorne knew better. He sat in the lab, staring at the acoustic data from that final night. The silence wasn't the whole story. Just before dawn, just before she rejoined her pod and started eating again, the hydrophones had picked up one last sound sequence. It wasn't the cry. It was a complex series of clicks and whistles, exchanged between Tahlequah and Onyx. It was a rapid-fire conversation, dense with information. And then a third voice had joined in. A voice that didn't belong to any known orca in the Salish Sea. It was a deep, powerful, pulsed call. It was slower, more guttural. It was the dialect of a transient, a mammal-eater. What was a transient doing there? Lena asked when Aris showed her the spectrogram. They're enemies. Residents and transients have been genetically distinct for 700,000 years. They don't mix. They don't talk. If a transient finds a resident, they usually flee. Or fight. They didn't attack, Aris said, pointing to the screen, his finger tracing the overlapping waves. They listened. And then they answered. The transient's call was short, sharp, and percussive. It wasn't a threat. It sounded like an acknowledgement, a response to a request. It sounded like a receipt being stamped. Aris zoomed in on the final moments of the recording. After the transient's call, the hydrophone picked up a faint splash. Not a breach, but a heavy object entering the water. And then, the sound of something heavy being dragged through the water column. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. She didn't just let the calf go, Aris whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She didn't just let it sink to the bottom. He looked at Lena, his eyes dark with a terrible unspoken thought. She gave it away. Why would a grieving mother give the body of her calf to her mortal enemy? Why would a resident orca, who views transients as dangerous wolves, hand over her most precious possession? What could she have possibly offered them in return? The happy ending of the internet's favorite story was a lie. The real story, the dark story, was just beginning. It was a story not of grief, but of a transaction. A deal made in the dark waters between a desperate mother and the killers of her kind. And Aris Thorne had a terrifying suspicion about what she had bought with the body of her child. It wasn't peace. It wasn't safety. It was revenge. The digital world has a short memory. For 2 weeks, the internet had collectively wept for J35, the grieving mother orca, carrying her dead child through the cold waters of the Salish Sea. The hashtag THLEQUAH was trending globally. Politicians gave earnest, empty speeches about conservation. School children in a dozen countries drew pictures of sad whales. But the moment she dropped the calf, the moment the visible spectacle of grief ended, the world exhaled a collective sigh of relief and swiped to the next video, the next outrage, the next meme. The news cycle churned on. The tour of grief was over, filed away as a touching, tragic nature documentary with a bittersweet ending. The whale had mourned, she had healed, and life in the ocean had returned to its ancient, rhythmic status quo. But inside the acoustically shielded basement of the Friday Harbor Labs, Dr. Aris Thorne was staring at a waveform that suggested the status quo had not just been disrupted, it had been detonated. The lab was quiet, save for the low hum of the server racks and the rhythmic whoosh of the building as ventilation system. It was 3 a.m. on a Thursday, 3 days after Tahlequah had released her calf. Aris and his grad student, Lena, hadn't slept in nearly 20 hours. They were listening to a ghost track, a recording that shouldn't exist, isolated from the hydrophone array in the Strait of Juan de Fuca from the night Tahlequah's vigil ended. "Play it again," Aris said, his voice raspy from exhaustion. He rubbed his eyes, which burned from staring at the screen. Filter out the tidal noise. Isolate the third voice. I want to hear it clean. Lena tapped the keyboard, her own face pale in the monitor's glow. The speakers crackled. First, the high, keening whistle of Tahlequah, the sound of the grieving mother. But this time, it was different. Shorter, more structured. Less a cry of pain and more a statement of intent. Then, the supportive, lower-frequency pulses of Onyx, the male escort, which seemed to echo and amplify her call. And then, the third voice cut in. It was a sound like a heavy chain being dragged across a concrete floor. Low, guttural, percussive, had none of the melodic quality of the resident calls. It was a sound built for violence. That is T-001, Aris said, his voice barely a whisper. That is the stranger. T-001 was a legend in the marine biology community, but of a very different kind than the playful, salmon-eating southern residents. He was the patriarch of a small, hyper-aggressive pod of transients, the mammal-eaters. The residents and transients had diverged on the evolutionary tree nearly 700,000 years ago. They did not speak the same language. They did not eat the same food. They did not interbreed. In fact, they usually avoided each other with a religiously adhered to distance. Residents feared transients. Transients ignored residents. They were two separate nations sharing the same water. Why would T-001 be talking to J-35? Lena asked, staring at the screen, where the sound waves overlapped in a jagged, impossible conversation. They don't have a shared syntax. It's like a human trying to speak to a Neanderthal, using only mathematical primes. It shouldn't work. Look at the spacing. Aris pointed to the gaps in the spectrogram. Tahlequah speaks. She repeats a specific sequence, a distress call, but modified, flattened. She's dumbing it down. She's making it universal. A simple, declarative statement. Then Onyx amplifies it, giving it weight. And then the stranger responds. One single, sharp burst. It's an affirmative. An affirmative to what? To the offering, Aris said. He stood up and walked to the whiteboard, which was covered in frantic scribbles, maps, and equations. We assumed she dropped the calf because she was exhausted. We assumed she finally accepted its death. But looking at the GPS data of the release point, she didn't just drop it. She delivered it. He drew a map on the board, circling a deep water canyon. She carried that carcass for 17 days, over 1,000 miles. She passed deep trenches. She passed currents that would have swept it away. She held onto it until she reached this specific coordinate. A coordinate where the T-transients are known to patrol. She wasn't just grieving Lena. She was transporting payment. The concept was terrifying in its implications. It suggested a level of cross-cultural negotiation, of abstract thought and bartering that biology said was impossible. It suggested that a resident whale, a pacifist fish-eater, had crossed the aisle to hire a hitman. You think she hired them? Lena looked skeptical, but her voice wavered. With what? A dead body? To a transient, a fresh calf carcass is high-calorie fat, Aris said, pacing in front of the board. It's a significant food source, but it's more than that. It's a gesture. Residents revere their dead. They stay with the bodies for days. For her to give it up, to give it to them, it's the ultimate sacrifice. It's the breaking of a taboo. It's blood money. But for what? Lena asked, standing up now, caught in the gravity of his theory. What could she possibly want the transients to do that was worth the body of her child? Residents can't fight, Aris said, looking at the dark window where the ocean lay hidden in the night. They aren't built for it. Their jaws are designed for grasping salmon, not tearing flesh. They are vocal, social, gentle. But transients? They are wolves. They take down gray whales. They shatter sea lion spines. They are the violence of the ocean made manifest. If you wanted to hurt something and you didn't know how, you'd go to the ones who do. The phone on the desk buzzed. It was a text from Aris Thorne, the sound recordist who had started it all. He had become Aris's unofficial eyes and ears on the water. "You need to see the marine traffic logs from last night. Something is happening in the strait. The Strait of Georgia is a highway. It is the jugular vein of the Pacific Northwest economy, a channel of cold water choked with container ships, oil tankers, tugboats, and ferries. It is a noisy industrial place where the natural world is usually forced to swim in the margins, their acoustic world shattered by the roar of human commerce. On this particular night, the heavy tug Goliath was churning southward, pulling a barge loaded with 3,000 tons of scrap metal. The Goliath was an old vessel, its twin diesel engines screaming at a decibel level that turned the water around it into a sonic dead zone. For decades, ships like the Goliath had been the bane of the southern residents. The noise masked the echolocation clicks the whales needed to find salmon. It was a wall of sound that caused starvation by deafness, blinding the whales in their own home. Captain Mike Henderson sat in the wheelhouse of the Goliath, nursing a lukewarm coffee and watching the radar. It was a clear night, the water calm. A boring run. Then the boat shuddered. It wasn't the jarring impact of a log or a deadhead. It was a lateral shove, as if a giant hand had slapped the hull from the side. What the hell was that? Henderson muttered, checking his stabilizers. They were functioning perfectly. He looked out the port window. The water was black and empty. He checked the depth cylinder. 300 feet. No rocks. Thump. Another hit. This one harder. It rang through the steel hull like a bell. The coffee cup slid across the console and smashed on the floor, splashing brown liquid across the charts. "Engine room report." Henderson barked into the intercom. "Skipper, we got a vibration on the port shaft." The engineer yelled back over the roar of the diesels. "Something hit the prop guard. Hard. Did we hit a net?" "No, it felt intentional. Like we were rammed." Henderson frowned. "Rammed by what?" "We're the biggest thing out here besides the tankers." He walked out onto the bridge wing and shone a powerful spotlight into the water. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the frothing white wash of the wake. At first, he saw nothing. Then, he saw the fins. They were tall, sharp, and black. Not the curved, friendly fins of the whales the tourists paid to see. These were jagged. They looked like weapons. There were 5 of them. They were surfing the pressure wave of the tug, moving with terrifying ease alongside the massive vessel, their bodies dark torpedoes in the illuminated water. "Orcas," Henderson said, relaxing slightly, a grin touching his lips. "Just blackfish. They're playing in the wake." But they weren't playing. As Henderson watched, the lead whale, a massive bull with a deep notch in its fin, veered inward. He accelerated toward the hull. He didn't turn away at the last second. He dropped his shoulder and slammed into the rudder post. The Goliath lurched violently to starboard. The barge behind it, still carrying its momentum, swung wide, the tow cable groaning under the sudden, immense tension. "They hit us." Henderson yelled, scrambling back into the wheelhouse, grabbing the wheel. "They're ramming the rudder." It was impossible. Whales didn't attack ships. They swam away. They were scared of the noise. But these whales weren't scared. They were angry. And they were coordinated. While the bull hammered the rudder, 2 smaller females dove under the stern. Henderson felt a horrific grinding sound vibrate through the deck plates, the scream of metal on metal, a sound that made his teeth ache. "We lost the port screw." The engineer screamed over the intercom. "The shaft is sheared. They put something in the prop." "What?" "I don't know. It sounded like bone. Or a rock. It's gone." The Goliath was losing power. With one engine dead and the rudder jammed hard over from the repeated impacts, the tug began to spiral. The massive barge behind it, a 3,000-ton battering ram moving at 10 knots, began to overtake the tug. The tow cable went slack, then snapped taut with a sound like a cannon shot as the barge swung around, threatening to debone its own tug. "Mayday, mayday!" Henderson shouted into the radio, his voice cracking with adrenaline and disbelief. "This is Tug Goliath. We are under attack by marine wildlife. We have lost propulsion and steering. Collision with barge is imminent." "Say again, Goliath?" the Coast Guard dispatcher asked, her voice calm and confused. "Did you say wildlife?" "Killer whales. A whole pack of them. They're tearing the stern apart." The Goliath rolled heavily as the barge clipped its stern quarter, metal screeching against metal. The tug took on water, the stern dipping low. The lights flickered and died, leaving the crew in the eerie red glow of the emergency battens. In the water below, TO-01, the stranger, circled the wounded prey. He didn't look at the humans on the deck. He didn't care about the meat inside the steel can. He looked at the mangled propellers, the source of the noise that had plagued his kind for generations. They were silent now. The heart of the beast had stopped beating. He let out a single sharp click train, a sound of finality. Task complete. The pod turned and vanished into the dark, leaving the Goliath drifting and broken in the shipping lane. By morning, the attack on the Goliath was international news. But the narrative was one of confusion and disbelief. Experts were trotted out on cable news to explain rogue animal behavior. They talked about parasites, about algae blooms affecting the brain, about territorial disputes. No one mentioned the transaction. No one connected the dots between a grieving mother's payment and a mercenary strike, except Aris Thorne. He was out on his skiff at dawn, miles away from the site of the attack, floating in the calm waters near the San Juan Islands. He had his hydrophone down. He was looking for G-Pod. He wanted to see how Tahlequah was coping. He found them near the shoreline, foraging. The mood of the pod was different. Usually, after a death, the resident whales were somber. Their vocalizations were subdued. They moved slowly. Today, G-Pod was energized. They were breaching. They were tail-slapping. They were vocalizing with a complexity and volume Alex had never recorded before. It sounded like a celebration. But it was what he heard in the background that chilled him. Far off, in the deep channel, the faint, echoing calls of the transients were fading away to the north. They were leaving the area. Their job was done. Alex recorded it all. He sat in his boat, listening to the two distinct dialects, the joyous chatter of the residents and the retreating, cold professionalism of the transients. It was a receipt, a confirmation of services rendered. He uploaded the file to Aris's secure server. He didn't post this one to Reddit. This was too dangerous. This wasn't a viral video. It was evidence of a conspiracy. Back at the lab, Aris and Lena listened to the recording. "She bought silence," Aris whispered. "The Goliath. It was one of the loudest ships in the fleet. It operated right in their foraging grounds. Its noise pollution reduced their echolocation efficiency by 40%. It was starving them. And maybe it hit her calf. Or its noise prevented her from hearing its distress calls. So she paid the transients to take it out?" Lena asked, her mind reeling at the strategic capability this implied. That's mob tactics. That's organized crime. It's survival, Aris said. The residents couldn't do it themselves. They don't have the jaw strength or the aggression. So they outsourced it. They hired mercenaries from across the border. But if they can do this, Lena looked at the map of the Salish Sea, dotted with hundreds of ships. If they realize this works, why would they stop at one tugboat? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. If the ocean had learned how to monetize violence, if different species were now collaborating to dismantle human infrastructure, then the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. We were no longer the observers. We were the targets. Aris looked at the screen where the news footage of the crippled Goliath was playing. The tug was being towed into port, a broken hulk. The pundits were still calling it a freak accident. They were laughing about Moby Dick references. They didn't understand. "We have to warn them," Lena said. "Warn who?" Aris asked, the cynicism heavy in his voice. "The Coast Guard? The Navy? Tell them that a grieving mother orca put a hit out on a tugboat? They'll lock us up in a rubber room. So we just watch?" "No," Aris said, grabbing his coat. "We go to the source. We need to find the stranger. We need to see if the contract is closed, or if this was just the down payment." They loaded their gear into the lab's Zodiac. The sky was turning gray again, a storm rolling in from the Pacific. The water looked different to Aris now. It wasn't just a habitat. It was a battlefield. And the other side had just engaged in its first act of asymmetric warfare. As they sped out toward the last known coordinates of the transient pod, Aris couldn't shake the image of Tahlequah carrying that calf. The world had seen grief. Aris now realized he had been looking at rage. A rage so deep, so profound, that it had bridged 1,000,000 years of evolution to find a weapon. The internet had broken because it felt sorry for her. If they knew the truth, they wouldn't be weeping. They would be terrified. Because the lonely whale wasn't lonely anymore. She had friends in low places. And they were very, very good at what they did. The gray, choppy waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca offered no comfort to the two scientists in the Zodiac. Aris steered the small, rigid-hulled inflatable boat further west, toward the open Pacific, where the swells grew larger and the horizon dissolved into a jagged, indistinct line of water and sky. Lena clutched the hydrophone cable, her knuckles white, her eyes scanning the waves. They were chasing a ghost, or perhaps a hit squad. The last known coordinates Alex had sent them were for a deep trench near the edge of the continental shelf, a place where the ocean floor dropped away into the abyss. It was a known patrol route for the transients, a highway for the wolves of the sea. Any signal? Aris shouted over the roar of the outboard motor, the wind whipping the words from his mouth. "Nothing yet," Lena yelled back, adjusting her headphones, shielding the sensitive equipment from the salt spray. "Just boat noise from the shipping lanes. And wait," she held up a hand. Aris immediately cut the engine. The silence rushed in, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the slap of water against the inflatable pontoons. "What is it?" Aris whispered, his own senses straining. "Click train," she whispered back, as if the whales could hear them. Slow, deliberate, bearing 270. "It's them." Aris looked west. The sun was setting, a bruised, angry orange smear on the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the water. How far? Close, maybe a mile. The signal was strong. They drifted, two small humans in a vast, uncaring wilderness of water. Aris scanned the waves with his binoculars. He saw nothing but the endless, rhythmic heaving of the ocean. But then, a blow. A tall, bushy spout of mist that lingered in the cold air like a phantom. Then another. And another. There were 6 of them. They were moving slowly, almost lazily, in a tight formation. In the center was a massive male with a dorsal fin that looked like a jagged knife against the sunset. T-001, the stranger. Aris felt a shiver of pure, primal fear. This wasn't a research subject anymore. This was a king surveying his domain after a successful raid. "They're stopping," Lena said, her voice a hushed breath. "They're logging." Logging is a resting behavior, where whales float motionless at the surface. It usually means they are sleeping or digesting a large meal. But these whales weren't sleeping. They were facing east, facing the strait, facing the world of men. "They're waiting," Aris said, focusing his binoculars. "For what? Another target?" As if in answer, the water around the pod began to boil. But it wasn't the whales moving. It was fish. Thousands of them. A massive school of herring was being pushed to the surface from below, a shimmering, panicked ball of silver in the dying light. "They're hunting?" Lena asked, confused. "Transients don't eat fish. It's a cultural taboo." They aren't eating them, Aris said, watching the behavior with a growing sense of dread. They're hurting them. They're using them as bait? Then the water exploded. From the depths beneath the herring ball, a shape rocketed to the surface. It wasn't an orca. It was a humpback whale. A juvenile, maybe 2 years old, but still a 30-ton behemoth. It lunged through the fish, its massive mouth agape engulfing hundreds of pounds of herring in a single gulp. The orcas didn't attack. They didn't flee. They watched. They held their perimeter. The humpback crashed back into the water and surfaced again, blowing hard. It swam directly toward the orcas. It didn't show fear. It didn't show aggression. It swam right up to the stranger. That's impossible, Lena breathed. Humpbacks hate transients. They fight them. They intervene in orca hunts to save seals. They are mortal enemies, the shepherds and the wolves. But the humpback wasn't fighting. It rolled onto its side, exposing its long, white pectoral fin. It slapped the water rhythmically. Slap, slap, slap. It was a greeting, a signal of parley. The stranger responded with a series of low-frequency pulses that Aris felt through the hull of the Zodiac. They're communicating, Aris said, the realization dawning on him with the force of a landslide. It's not just residents and transients. It's spreading. They're recruiting other species. They're forming a multi-species coalition. The implications were staggering. Humpback whales are the tanks of the ocean. They are massive, powerful, and notoriously altruistic. If the orcas, the strategic masterminds, had managed to turn their ancient enemies into allies, it wasn't just a gang anymore. It was an army. Why? Lena asked. Why would a humpback work with a killer whale? The same reason the residents did, Aris said. A common enemy. The noise, the ships, the nets, the Goliath attack. That wasn't just a contract killing. That was a proof of concept. It was a recruiting video. They showed the other species that it could be done. They showed them that the gods could bleed. The humpback dove, followed closely by the transient pod. They were heading deeper, toward the shipping lanes that crisscrossed the entrance to the strait. We have to follow them, Aris said, starting the engine. Aris, look at the fuel gauge, Lena warned, her voice tight with anxiety. We're almost at half. If we go further out, we might not make it back. We're in the open ocean now. We have to know, Aris said, pushing the throttle forward. This changes everything. If they hit a tanker, if they hit a cruise ship, the environmental disaster, the loss of life. They followed the pod for an hour, keeping a dangerous distance, their small boat dwarfed by the Pacific swells. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a gray twilight. The whales were moving fast now, porpoising with purpose. They were heading for the traffic separation scheme, the highway for the biggest ships on the ocean. Ahead of them, the lights of a vessel appeared. It was a massive container ship, the Shanghai Express, fully loaded, churning toward the port of Vancouver. It was a city of steel, 1,000 feet long, carrying 20,000 containers of goods that fueled the modern world. They can't attack that, Lena said, her voice a mix of awe and terror at the ship's scale. It's too big. It would be like a dog attacking a skyscraper. They don't have to sink it, Aris said, his eyes fixed on the ship. They just have to stop it. The whales split up. The humpback dove deep, disappearing from view. The orcas fanned out, taking positions on either side of the massive ship's bow. Then the humpback resurfaced, right in front of the ship. It breached. 40 tons of whale launched into the air, a mountain of living flesh against the bruised twilight, crashing down directly in the path of the container ship. The ship's horn blasted a deafening, bone-shaking sound that rolled across the water, the collision alarm. The humpback didn't move. It logged on the surface, a massive biological roadblock. The captain of the Shanghai Express had a choice. Hit the whale, potentially cracking the hull and causing an international incident, or emergency stop. He chose the stop. The ship's engines reversed. The water at the stern turned into a cauldron of white foam as the massive props fought the ship's momentum. The hull shuddered. The ship began to slow, veering slightly to starboard as it lost steerage. That was the trap. As the ship slowed and turned, it exposed its rudder and propellers to the deep water. The transients moved in. This time, they didn't ram. They carried debris. Aris watched through his night vision binoculars as the whales dragged heavy, waterlogged logs and discarded fishing nets ghost gear toward the ship's stern. They released the debris into the powerful suction of the reversing propellers. The sound was horrific, audible even from a mile away. A grinding, screeching tear as the hardened steel blades chewed into the wood and net. The engine note changed from a low roar to a high-pitched whine. Then, a boom that echoed across the water. The Shanghai Express lost power. The lights on the deck flickered and went out, leaving the ship a dark silhouette against the sky. The ship drifted, dead in the water, blocking the entire inbound shipping lane. "They disabled a container ship," Lena whispered. "With garbage. They're weaponizing our own trash," Aris said, his voice grim. "They're using our pollution against us. It's a form of poetic justice." The radio erupted with chaos. The Shanghai Express was calling Mayday. Other ships were diverting. The Coast Guard was scrambling helicopters and tugs. But in the water, the Alliance was already gone. They had struck and vanished into the darkness. Aris turned the Zodiac around. They were low on fuel, cold, and terrified. But they had the evidence. They had the story. "We have to publish this," Lena said, her teeth chattering. "The world needs to know what they're doing." "If we publish this," Aris said, steering the boat back toward the distant lights of the coast, "the Navy will declare war on the ocean. They won't see a coalition of animals. They'll see an enemy combatant. They'll drop depth charges. They'll sanitize the strait. They'll kill everything. So what do? We just let them dismantle the world's economy? We find a way to talk to them," Aris said, though the words sounded insane even to him. "We find a way to negotiate, because if this escalates, we lose. The ocean is 70% of the planet. We are just the tourists." They made it back to the harbor on fumes, just as the storm hit. They didn't speak. The magnitude of what they had seen was too heavy for words. That night, Aris sat in his office, staring at the spectrogram of the humpback slapping the water. It was a rhythm, a code. He was trying to find the syntax. He opened a file on his computer. He began to type, not a scientific paper, a manifesto, a warning to the powers that be. But before he could finish, his screen went black. A message appeared in white text, typed out letter by letter. "We are listening." It wasn't a hacker. It wasn't the government. The intrusion was too elegant, too seamless. The cursor moved on its own. It opened a new audio file. Aris put on his headphones, his heart pounding. It was the cry, Tahlequah's cry. But it was different. It was layered. Thousands of voices. Orcas, humpbacks, dolphins, pilot whales, a chorus of the deep, a symphony of rage. And underneath it all, a low, synthesized voice, constructed from the clicks and whistles of 100 different species, manipulated to mimic human speech. "Stop the noise." Aris ripped the headphones off. He stared at the screen. They weren't just coordinating attacks. They were hacking. They had learned to interface with the underwater fiber optic cables that lay on the sea floor. They were inside the network. The internet hadn't just broken because of a sad video. It had been probed, tested, and now the real message was being delivered directly to the man who had been listening the closest. The phone rang. It was Alex. "Aris," Alex said, his voice panicked. "Check the news. It's happening everywhere. All at once." Aris turned on the TV. Breaking news banners scrolled across the screen. Tokyo Bay blocked by massive pod of whales. Oil tankers adrift in the North Sea, rudders disabled. Panama Canal closed due to dolphin blockade. It was a global insurrection. A coordinated planetary strike. The ocean was closing its borders. Aris looked out the window at the dark water of the harbor. He realized then that the silence he had cherished, the peace of the sea, was over. The lonely whale hadn't been crying for help. She had been crying havoc. And now, the dogs of war were slipping their leashes. The world did not end with a bang, but with a blockade. In the weeks following the coordinated global strikes on shipping, the human economy began to suffocate. Ports were paralyzed, becoming vast parking lots for useless steel. Oil prices skyrocketed as tankers refused to leave the safety of the harbors, their captains terrified of the silent, intelligent torpedoes that waited in the deep. The Blue Revolution, as the pundits on the 24-hour news channels had dubbed it, was not a political movement. It was a biological siege. Governments scrambled. Navies were deployed. Depth charges were dropped in empty stretches of ocean. A futile, angry display of force against an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. But fighting an enemy that lives in 3 dimensions, travels in silence, and covers 70% of the planet proved impossible. For every whale killed in the retaliatory strikes, 3 ships were disabled. The ocean was simply too big, and the enemy was too smart. Dr. Aris Thorne sat in his office at the Friday Harbor Labs, which had become a bunker of data and despair. He had become the reluctant face of the crisis, the man who had heard the first warning shot, the Cassandra of the cetacean world. His inbox was a digital landfill of death threats from unemployed longshoremen and desperate pleas for a solution from government agencies he had once despised. But he wasn't looking for a solution. He was looking for a translation. They aren't just saying stop, he told Lena, who was asleep at her desk, her head resting on a stack of acoustic printouts. They're negotiating. The attacks are targeted. They hit the loudest ships. The ones with the worst sonar profiles, the polluters, the seismic survey vessels. It's selective enforcement. They aren't just lashing out. They are pruning. They are sending a message. He played the file again, the one that had appeared on his computer. The chorus of 1,000 whale voices and the synthesized, chilling demand. Stop. The noise. We need to talk back, he said, the idea solidifying in his exhausted mind. How? Lena mumbled, waking up, rubbing her eyes. We don't speak whale. We speak math, Aris said, walking to the whiteboard. We speak frequency. We need to broadcast a counteroffer, a truce. We need to show them that we can be quiet. He spent the next 3 days building a transmission. He and Lina worked in a feverish, sleep-deprived haze, fueled by stale coffee and the dawning horror of their responsibility. He used the powerful hydrophone array at the lab, reversing its function, turning the listening station into a broadcast tower. He created a synthetic call, a complex blend of southern resident greeting codes, transient appeasement signals he had isolated from old recordings, and the rhythmic, patient clicks of sperm whales. It was a simple message, encoded in the universal binary of sound and silence. We hear you. We will quiet the water. Meeting point. Harrow Strait. We will listen. He hit send. The signal blasted out into the Salish Sea, a focused beam of acoustic diplomacy, traveling at 1,500 meters per second. Then they waited. For 24 hours, nothing. The attacks around the world continued. A cruise ship in the Mediterranean was rammed by a pod of pilot whales and had to be evacuated. A Russian nuclear submarine in the Arctic was deafened by a bubble net and forced to surface, a humiliating defeat that was quickly covered up by both sides. Then, at dawn on the second day, the answer came, a single soft ping on the sonar. And another, and a chorus. The water in front of the lab began to churn. It wasn't just a pod. It was a congregation. G-Pod was there. K-Pod, the pod, the entire southern resident clan. Flanking them, holding a respectful distance, was the stranger's pod of transients. Further out, the massive shapes of humpbacks and a single gray whale logged on the surface. They formed a silent, breathing wall of flesh, a semicircle around the pier where Aris now stood. And in the center of the formation, supported on either side by Onyx and the stranger, was Tahlequah. She looked thin. The peanut head depression behind her blowhole was pronounced, a sign of her long fast and the energy she had expended. But her eye was clear. It was not the eye of a grieving mother. It was the eye of a general who had just won a war. Aris walked out onto the pier. He held a portable hydrophone speaker, the device feeling flimsy and inadequate in his hands. He felt small. He felt like an insect standing before gods. The weight of their collective intelligence was a physical pressure in the air. "We are listening," he said into the microphone, his voice amplified underwater, a strange, tinny intrusion into their world. "We will stop the noise. We will give you the lanes. We will establish quiet zones." The stranger slapped his tail. A gunshot sound that echoed across the water. Not enough. Tahlequah moved forward. She let out a cry. It wasn't the mournful wail that had broken the internet. It was a command. A sharp, ascending whistle that demanded attention. The message was clear, even without translation. Leave. It wasn't a request for quiet. It was an eviction notice. Aris looked at the assembled whales. He saw the scars on their skin, from propellers and nets, the notches in their fins, the history of a century of abuse written on their bodies. We had poisoned their milk, deafened their ears, stolen their children for theme parks, and emptied their larders until they starved. "We can't leave," Aris said, his voice cracking, pleading with a species that had no reason to show mercy. "We live here too. This is our home too." The stranger submerged. A moment later, the pier shuddered violently. He had rammed the piling beneath Aris's feet. The wood groaned, and a crack appeared in the concrete foundation. It was a warning. "This is not a debate." Aris looked at Lena, who was standing at the door of the lab, her hand on the emergency phone. "Shut it down," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "Shut down the generator, the pumps, the servers, everything. Aris, do it. They want silence. Give them silence. Show them we can." Lena ran inside. Moments later, the low hum of the lab died. The lights went out. The only sound was the wind, the cry of a distant gull, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the whales. The stranger resurfaced. He didn't ram again. He waited. Slowly, tentatively, the other whales began to turn. They didn't leave. They just relaxed. The tension in the water dissipated. They began to socialize. A calf breached in the distance. A mother rolled onto her back, her calf resting on her belly. They were reclaiming the space. Aris realized then that the war wasn't about destruction. It was about space. It was about the right to exist without the constant, maddening roar of human progress. It was about the simple, profound need for quiet. The blockade held for a month. In that time, the silence of the ocean became a global reality. Shipping companies, bleeding trillions of dollars, agreed to new, slower routes that avoided critical habitats. Global speed limits were enforced on all vessels. Military sonar was restricted to times of declared war. The world slowed down, and the whales stopped attacking. The Goliath was scrapped, its metal recycled. The Shanghai Express was towed away, its hull scarred but intact. The ocean returned to a fragile, negotiated peace. Tahlequah survived. She was seen months later, swimming with G-Pod. She wasn't carrying a calf, but she wasn't alone. She was swimming next to a new calf, not hers, but her sister's. She was helping to raise the next generation in a quieter world. But she had changed the world. She had proven that grief is a force of nature, and that even the smallest voice, if broken enough, can shatter the silence and demand to be heard. We often look at the ocean as a resource, a highway, or a playground. We forget that it is a nation with its own laws, its own language, and its own armies. We forget that we are just tourists standing on the edge of a deep, dark continent that does not belong to us. We have been terrible neighbors. The story of Tahlequah is a warning. It is a reminder that we are not the masters of this planet. We are a single, noisy species in a world of silent, listening intelligences. And like any neighbor, if we make too much noise, if we take too much, eventually, the folks next door will come knocking. And they are bigger than us. So the next time you hear the sound of the ocean, listen closely. Is it the peaceful lap of waves against the shore? Or is it the silence of a truce that hangs by a thread? A silence that could be broken by a single mournful cry? If this story made you think, if it made you look at the blue expanse on the map with a little more respect and a little more fear, hit that like button and subscribe. We have more stories from the edge of the wild coming soon. Stories that remind us of our place in the world. Stay safe, stay quiet, and remember, don't wake the deep. The world did not end with a bang, but with a blockade. In the weeks following the coordinated global strikes on shipping, the human economy began to suffocate. Ports were paralyzed, becoming vast parking lots for useless steel. Oil prices skyrocketed as tankers refused to leave the safety of the harbors, their captains terrified of the silent, intelligent torpedoes that waited in the deep. The Blue Revolution, as the pundits on the 24-hour news channels had dubbed it, was not a political movement. It was a biological siege. Governments scrambled. Navies were deployed. Depth charges were dropped in empty stretches of ocean. A futile, angry display of force against an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. But fighting an enemy that lives in 3 dimensions, travels in silence, and covers 70% of the planet proved impossible. For every whale killed in the retaliatory strikes, 3 ships were disabled. The ocean was simply too big, and the enemy was too smart. Dr. Aris Thorne sat in his office at the Friday Harbor Labs, which had become a bunker of data and despair. He had become the reluctant face of the crisis, the man who had heard the first warning shot, the Cassandra of the cetacean world. His inbox was a digital landfill of death threats from unemployed longshoremen and desperate pleas for a solution from government agencies he had once despised. But he wasn't looking for a solution. He was looking for a translation. They aren't just saying stop, he told Lena, who was asleep at her desk, her head resting on a stack of acoustic printouts. They're negotiating. The attacks are targeted. They hit the loudest ships, the ones with the worst sonar profiles, the polluters, the seismic survey vessels. It's selective enforcement. They aren't just lashing out. They are pruning. They are sending a message. He played the file again, the one that had appeared on his computer. The chorus of 1,000 whale voices and the synthesized, chilling demand. Stop the noise. We need to talk back, he said, the idea solidifying in his exhausted mind. How? Lena mumbled, waking up, rubbing her eyes. We don't speak whale. We speak math, Aris said, walking to the whiteboard. We speak frequency. We need to broadcast a counteroffer, a truce. We need to show them that we can be quiet. He spent the next 3 days building a transmission. He and Lena worked in a feverish, sleep-deprived haze, fueled by stale coffee and the dawning horror of their responsibility. He used the powerful hydrophone array at the lab, reversing its function, turning the listening station into a broadcast tower. He created a synthetic call, a complex blend of southern resident greeting codes, transient appeasement signals he had isolated from old recordings, and the rhythmic, patient clicks of sperm whales. It was a simple message, encoded in the universal binary of sound and silence. We hear you. We will quiet the water. Meeting point, Harrow Strait. We will listen. He hit send. The signal blasted out into the Salish Sea, a focused beam of acoustic diplomacy traveling at 1,500 meters per second. Then they waited. For 24 hours, nothing. The attacks around the world continued. A cruise ship in the Mediterranean was rammed by a pod of pilot whales and had to be evacuated. A Russian nuclear submarine in the Arctic was deafened by a bubble net and forced to surface. A humiliating defeat that was quickly covered up by both sides. Then, at dawn on the second day, the answer came. A single soft ping on the sonar, then another, then a chorus. The water in front of the lab began to churn. It wasn't just a pod. It was a congregation. G-Pod was there. K-Pod, the pod, the entire southern resident clan. Flanking them, holding a respectful distance, was the stranger's pod of transients. Further out, the massive shapes of humpbacks and a single gray whale logged on the surface. They formed a silent, breathing wall of flesh, a semicircle around the pier where Aris now stood. And in the center of the formation, supported on either side by Onyx and the stranger, was Tahlequah. She looked thin. The peanut head depression behind her blowhole was pronounced, a sign of her long fast and the energy she had expended. But her eye was clear. It was not the eye of a grieving mother. It was the eye of a general who had just won a war. Aris walked out onto the pier. He held a portable hydrophone speaker, the device feeling flimsy and inadequate in his hands. He felt small. He felt like an insect standing before gods. The weight of their collective intelligence was a physical pressure in the air. "We are listening," he said into the microphone, his voice amplified underwater, a strange, tinny intrusion into their world. "We will stop the noise. We will give you the lanes. We will establish quiet zones." The stranger slapped his tail. A gunshot sound that echoed across the water. Not enough. Tahlequah moved forward. She let out a cry. It wasn't the mournful wail that had broken the internet. It was a command. A sharp, ascending whistle that demanded attention. The message was clear, even without translation. Leave. It wasn't a request for quiet. It was an eviction notice. Aris looked at the assembled whales. He saw the scars on their skin, from propellers and nets, the notches in their fins, the history of a century of abuse written on their bodies. We had poisoned their milk, deafened their ears, stolen their children for theme parks, and emptied their larders until they starved. "We can't leave," Aris said, his voice cracking, pleading with a species that had no reason to show mercy. "We live here too. This is our home too." The stranger submerged. A moment later, the pier shuddered violently. He had rammed the piling beneath Aris's feet. The wood groaned, and a crack appeared in the concrete foundation. It was a warning. "This is not a debate." Aris looked at Lena, who was standing at the door of the lab, her hand on the emergency phone. "Shut it down," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "Shut down the generator, the pumps, the servers, everything. Aris, do it. They want silence. Give them silence. Show them we can." Lena ran inside. Moments later, the low hum of the lab died. The lights went out. The only sound was the wind, the cry of a distant gull, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the whales. The stranger resurfaced. He didn't ram again. He waited. Slowly, tentatively, the other whales began to turn. They didn't leave. They just relaxed. The tension in the water dissipated. They began to socialize. A calf breached in the distance. A mother rolled onto her back, her calf resting on her belly. They were reclaiming the space. Aris realized then that the war wasn't about destruction. It was about space. It was about the right to exist without the constant, maddening roar of human progress. It was about the simple, profound need for quiet. The blockade held for a month. In that time, the silence of the ocean became a global reality. Shipping companies, bleeding trillions of dollars, agreed to new, slower routes that avoided critical habitats. Global speed limits were enforced on all vessels. Military sonar was restricted to times of declared war. The world slowed down, and the whales stopped attacking. The Goliath was scrapped, its metal recycled. The Shanghai Express was towed away, its hull scarred but intact. The ocean returned to a fragile, negotiated peace. Tahlequah survived. She was seen months later, swimming with J-Pod. She wasn't carrying a calf, but she wasn't alone. She was swimming next to a new calf, not hers, but her sister's. She was helping to raise the next generation in a quieter world, but she had changed the world. She had proven that grief is a force of nature, and that even the smallest voice, if broken enough, can shatter the silence and demand to be heard. We often look at the ocean as a resource, a highway, or a playground. We forget that it is a nation with its own laws, its own language, and its own armies. We forget that we are just tourists standing on the edge of a deep, dark continent that does not belong to us. We have been terrible neighbors. The story of Tahlequah is a warning. It is a reminder that we are not the masters of this planet. We are a single, noisy species in a world of silent, listening intelligences. And like any neighbor, if we make too much noise, if we take too much, eventually, the folks next door will come knocking. And they are bigger than us. So the next time you hear the sound of the ocean, listen closely. Is it the peaceful lap of waves against the shore? Or is it the silence of a truce that hangs by a thread? A silence that could be broken by a single mournful cry? If this story made you think, if it made you look at the blue expanse on the map with a little more respect and a little more fear, hit that like button and subscribe. We have more stories from the edge of the wild coming soon. Stories that remind us of our place in the world. Stay safe, stay quiet, and remember, don't wake the deep.